Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Eugene Saucy. I'm originally from the Philippines and currently based here in Brisbane, Australia. So I'm a postgraduate student taking Master of Development Practice at the University of Queensland. So I'm one of the working committee members of the Student Forum. Um, the workshop today will tackle the research method, particularly on inclusive and ethical aspect. So you can post questions while the session is ongoing. The Q&A icon below, and not the chat icon, so you can see it on your Zoom um, template. So we can now proceed to the workshop proper. So I'll be introducing our presenter. So Ms. Sumaya Saluja is the Inclusive Government Advisor with the Asia Foundation and currently based in Yangon, Myanmar. She works with over 14 country offices in the region, providing support and advice on programs focused on urban governance, decentralization, and civic space. She has also worked with the Asia Foundation's governance program in Myanmar as the social accountability lead. Prior to the Prior to the Asia Foundation, Sumaya has led policy-focused research and managed programs focused on statelessness, sexual and reproductive health and rights, education, and combating hate speech in India, Egypt, and Myanmar, and globally with the UN Global Education First Initiative. So please help me welcome Ms. Sumaya Saluja.
Thanks, Eugene, and thank you everyone for attending. It's really heartening to see so many names on Zoom, even though this is an online conference. So really happy to have all of you join, and also big congratulations to everyone who's organized this conference, because we all know how difficult it is to do so under these circumstances. Over the course of this next hour, I was hoping to be able to share a little bit more in terms of what we mean by inclusive and ethical research methods, but also I really do not want this to be a lecture and try to make it a little interactive. So we will be using tools like Menti and Jamboard. And I gave a short demo in the beginning of each so that it's easy to, and hope it's not too difficult for everyone in being able to use it. When we do have discussions, I would encourage bandwidth permitting, and if you are comfortable, to actually switch on your video and say hi or wave, and it'd be really nice to also see everybody who is attending. So to just start off, I will just share my screen. In terms of what I'm hoping to do, what we're hoping to do today is, over the next hour, is share examples from a multi-city study on inequalities in Asian cities that the Asia Foundation and Core Global has been working on. We'll do this by and we'll use that as a case study to unpack what are the key principles, and what we mean when we say inclusive and ethical research, what that means in terms of application across the research process. And finally, we'll conclude with some reflections. We are 1 year into this process, and there are lots of things that we've been learning ourselves and ways that we would approach things differently, or things that we are just reflections to note for next time. Before going further, however, it would be really great to understand who else is in the room and what your background has been. So I will put in the slide a link to Mentimeter and ask you all to look at it. And while we are doing that, if for this session, for the next 10 minutes as we're going through Mentimeter, if you are comfortable and have the bandwidth to open, to switch on your video, that'd be really appreciated, and you can just wave. But I'll just send you the link. So what I was hoping to do as a start for the Mentimeter is just basically start off with a sheep's tail and a check-in to just see how you're doing. So if you do And this is just also helps us practice the tool. If you go to menti.com and use that code, you should be able to get a link where you can choose an option. Otherwise, there's also a link that I've set. So we've gotten one, which is sheep 6. So based on whichever sheep you feel represents your mood the most, if you could click that. All right, so this seems to be working. Oh, lots of 5s. I'm usually sheep 4 whenever we do this. Okay, some excitement. All right, so we have a range of emotions of what people are feeling right now. Sheep 3 and 5, so a little bit of drowsiness, but I'll stop sharing right now and we can move on to, if you refresh the link, you will see that we have changed to a previous question. I feel people have. And the first question is, have you led qualitative research before? So is this something that you have led before? So there seems to be quite an equal split in terms of everybody's background in having led qualitative research. Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next question. And here again, you can just refresh your link and it'll update and you'll be able to add in your response, which is maybe you haven't led a whole qualitative research process, but you've been involved in it in like the different stages. And so if that's a yes, please note yes. If that's a no, that is also totally all right. And hopefully this would be a good entry point in terms of engaging with some of these concepts. Okay, so we have quite a few participants who have actually been involved in a qualitative research process, but few who haven't. Also, that shouldn't deter you from asking any questions through the course of this presentation. All right, to our next, and this is really quickly in terms of if you've been involved in research, which of these phases have you been involved in? And here it's you can click as many options as possible. So you can respond to more than one. So has it been across the whole cycle or through at like different junctures of the research process? It's interesting. A lot of people who've been involved in data collection and writing quite a few, but less who've been involved in research design. Even a smaller cohort saying being involved in data collection, and then this, the least being in research uptake. And this is really interesting, and we'll talk about some of this through the course of the hour. All right, so the next one is not a poll, but something where you can actually give your own opinion. So what would be really useful is if you could tell us what you think of when you think of inclusive and ethical research. Please do not use the word inclusive or ethical, but when you think of these words and you think of it in the context of conducting research, predominantly qualitative, that's what this a presentation is going to focus on, what comes to mind. And if you could just put in, just add in, it could be a word or a statement, and that would come up here. And if you refresh the same link, you should be able to see an option for this. So these are excellent. Also makes what I'm going to say, I hope it's still useful, because I feel everybody's covering quite a bit of what this process already entails, which is things like ensuring that principles of do no harm are embedded in the research process. It's considerate of cultural and social factors. It's community-based and participatory. Partnerships are really important. How we're represented, what is fair representation of participants is also actually really, and making sure that we're being true to the voice that we've been captured is essential. Human rights-based approaches. Inclusion of people who are living with disabilities, fair representation, gaining insights from groups, from a range of different participants. Our own potentiality should be interrogated, gender sensitive. Research that is informed by and useful to those who are most impacted. And it is useful and beneficial. These are excellent. Thank you so much. All right, I will at this point move forward, and I'm sorry I'm moving through this pretty quickly. It's more because it's 1 hour. And so this is the last question. When you think about constraints, because obviously all these words that came out and all the reflections are excellent, and it is things that we would like to see happen. So then the question is, if there is a challenge when it comes to ensuring research is inclusive or ethical, what in your experience has been those, what have been some of these big challenges? And yes, you can also multiple choice for this. It could be all of them, some of them. And for those who may not have conducted research, it could be a speculation on why you think this is the case. So time is a big challenge, after which financial resources and lack of buy-in among decision makers. And then technical know-how as a close third. Would be very, for those who are saying other, would really encourage you to maybe add in or give a note of what the other is in the chat box, so we could also see that, because I do understand that this may not be a full list. But the big reason that is coming through everybody is time. And that is a really, that is a big constraining factor for sure. And I think that's where a bit of it links to the buy-in from decision makers, that those who are funding and commissioning research are able to provide and allocate the amount of time that is actually needed to ensure that the process of the research is inclusive and ethical. All right, thank you very much, everyone. I will exit this for the moment and move on, go back to the presentation, but we will have a chance to continue discussing this. If you have questions while I am talking, I would really encourage you to use the chat function and add in your questions, and I will try my best to make sure that I am responding to them. So just give me. All right. So again, thank you so much. As a lot of what also came out in terms of what you had mentioned, for us, we really looked at research and especially ethical research and grounded it on 4 principles. These principles are the same that have been listed on the RDI website. So I will go through them fairly quickly right now, but do visit the website and you will find a lot more information on what these principles mean and what does it also mean to apply them in practice. For us as researchers, research managers, or commissioners of research, it is really important that research that is conducted prioritizes at the minimum the safety and well-being of everyone involved. To move further, for us, what it means if we look at principle 1 is that the well-being of researchers and research participants is more important than the research itself. In COVID, this is particularly important as there are multiple challenges that have been added on to conducting research in a safe way. It also means that research should be set up in a way that gathers the necessary data, but in a safe, enjoyable, and non-extractive way. The second is that the research needs to be of value, and that also came up in the responses that you had provided, and that it is collected for a reason. And it does so by prioritizing do no harm and is aware of unintended consequences along the way. The third relates to our own capacities as researchers. So ensuring that the people who do conduct research have the competence and skills to carry out that research, and that research should be clear and consistent, and its purpose and the logic of that is reflected through all the processes of to the entire research process. And finally, that the process, it should be inclusive, that the process of selecting people to take part in the research needs to be fair, and the burden placed on individuals and groups for participating in it should be reasonable. Care should be taken to ensure that the research process does not, even unintentionally, act to further discriminate against and exclude marginalized groups. And so in practice, it's a lot of, and there are a lot of details, but for us, we try to make it concise in terms of 5 key points that I have summarized here in terms of it being of value and informing positive change, it being grounded in and responsive to local context. It's being really clear and consistent about its process and why we're taking someone's time and asking for information. For those who are involved, it is respectful, it's enjoyable, it's ideally empowering, and it's not extractive, and that participation along the way is informed, optional, free, and safe. So moving to the process that we embarked on. This is the learnings that and the tools that I will share today will come out of a process that we've been on, a journey we've been on for the last year. And this is work that we've done between the Asia Foundation and Core Global. And we started with wanting to conduct policy relevant and forward-looking research on inclusive urban governance in Asia. And so then in consultation with DFAT, who's our donor, we started with a big research question, which is, what is the current and likely future impact of the COVID pandemic on inequalities in Asian cities? The research also had a parallel goal of building the capacities of local researchers, which in our case were our local staff in each of the Asia Foundation country offices. And we wanted to invest in their abilities to lead the research from the research design phase to data collection and data analysis. To do so, we first started with a process where we brought together a cohort of local researchers who took an 8-module course on qualitative research. And following the course, we set up a country research team that were then supported by a mentor who worked with them through the course of this process to ensure that we were putting in the time and investments to ensure that everybody's feeling competent and comfortable with the research process. This part I will come back to later, because something that we have learned through the course of this journey is that we ideally now don't want to do the learning course at the beginning and then move to the research, but have it peppered in a more parallel way, as that would is much more beneficial for learning and application than the way we did it. So that's one of the things that we would change if we were to do it again. In terms of our application, we started by breaking up the research process in different stages and noting the key ethical considerations for each of the stages, which I've listed here. And this enabled us to build tools and tailor the mentorship process on each of those phases and ensure that we were actually considering and accounting for each of these considerations when it came to research ethics and conducting inclusive research. You will notice that research uptake or thinking about how the research will actually be used and how to make sure that it actually has the highest potential of informing positive change is not something that we saw as stage 6 at the end of the project, but something that was continuing from the beginning and needed to be thought of from the beginning. So for example, even an initial tool that we had where we had researchers write down what the purpose and scope of the research was really explicit from the beginning, where we wanted to identify who this research was being directed to and who needed to answer these questions and why and how. Providing them with that information would enable a change that we were seeking to influence or an action we were seeking to influence through this research. So moving to how we designed the research, and we began by first, because this was a research that was spread across 7 different countries where we were looking to select one city to conduct a research that would produce country-specific analysis, but then also regional analysis. And so for us, it was first really important to clarify what we ourselves meant with inequalities, and therefore how we would map the impact of COVID-19 on inequalities in Asian cities. So we discussed the various perspectives from the team, and a number of themes emerged that we wanted the research to look at. For example, for us, inequalities took various forms, and it wasn't just about income or wealth. Second, that it operates at a range of levels, from the household and community all the way to market and state. And third, we also wanted to look at inequality of outcomes, and this relates to capabilities. So for example, a concern ultimately with what people are able to be and what they're able to do. We captured this by building a conceptual framework, which I've copied, which you can see on the slide, which we've called the 5 C's framework for each of the C's, which is context, capital, capabilities, the 4th C being COVID, and the 5th C being cities. This framework, therefore, not only allowed us to capture our understanding of inequality, but enabled us to communicate it with others and adapt this to local contexts. And because for us, each of the dimensions were interrelated and of equal importance, once this conceptual framework was developed, it guided the selection of specific research topics that were relevant and valuable in each of the 7 cities. And so researchers could then pick the entry point across this from any point. So they could start either from the impact on households or community, or they could look at the impact from the market and then move forward to each the elements that were most relevant to their research. I am aware of time. What I was hoping to do is we have videos of our researchers who have that explain how this was, how they use the 5 C's framework to identify their own research design, but this is something that maybe I will email forward as an update for those who are interested. And all of these videos are on Vimeo for anyone to see. And this and I will also, I'm very happy to share this presentation at the end, where you can then see in more detail how we came up with interrelated and contextually relevant topics for each of the cities. The last point with our research design was that the last component was the literature review. And the reason to highlight this from a research ethics perspective is that we wanted to make sure that the questions we were focusing on for our primary data collection were ones where there was not enough knowledge on or were not well understood, and that our research was actually contributing to the knowledge base that already existed. And to do that, the literature review is particularly necessary. Moving onwards to the second part of the research project. For sorry, I think I dropped off. I think this is, my screen should be sharing. So restarting with, I was at the point where I was just discussing from a research and ethics perspective, we wanted to focus on making sure that we had ample depth rather than breadth, but we also wanted to ensure that we had diversity in our research sample. The second component of the data collection is in the how, which is the part where, this is our assumption, is where there is a lot more information and a lot more work that does get done across different research teams. And this relates to how data is collected from everything from the data collection tool, how we're reaching out and confirming interviews, making sure that we're setting the right expectations, and that and how we're conducting and closing the interview, and making sure that there is consent that is interspersed throughout. So I will cover that after at the later part of this workshop, but I'll spend a little less time on it, as it is something that is a part that a lot of people do focus on. So coming back to what we looked at in terms of, and this is the inclusive dimension of how we wanted to approach our sampling. And so if we take a step and we start thinking about how, in a qualitative research project, the fact that we want to include different voices, and we can start off with, for example, saying we want to interview men and women. And one of the things that a conclusion that we'd come to was you need about 8 people from each of those groups to meaningfully be able to say something about. So that's 8 and 8. If you move forward and we say, okay, we just don't want women and men, we want older women, younger women, and older men and younger men. And because we want to be able to compare between age and gender, we will have 8 of each of these categories, and that would make our sample size 32. Then we realized that actually we also want to ensure that we're bringing in people living with disabilities. And we want to do that for younger women, older women, younger men, older men. And because we want to compare with all of that across all of those groups, we have 8 from each of those groups, and that gets us to a sample size of 64. That for us is a bit of a disaster, mainly because, as everyone had mentioned, time is a major constraint when it comes to conducting qualitative research. And if we think about this mathematically, on average, 64 interviews mean at least 5 to 6 pages of transcript for each interview that needs to be cleaned, maybe needs to be translated, and then needs to be coded and analyzed. On a research ethics perspective, if we have taken time of people who've given us time and answered our questions, we should know and we should ensure that we have sufficient time for analysis to be able to truly go through their responses and include them in the final analysis. At 64 interviews, that becomes really, really difficult if we don't have the time. So our approach was to think about, okay, how do we ensure that we can strive for inclusion and diversity, but still maintain a sample size that is manageable and where we will be able to give enough care and time to each of the transcripts that we collect through our data collection process. And we did so by starting with a basic criteria of we did this by starting with a 3-step approach to sampling. And this begins first with a basic entry criteria. So based on your research topic, you start and think through, okay, who is it that I would like to have included in my research? And this could be broad, for example, people who live in a particular city who have been laid off from the tourism sector in the last 10 months. After which we can move to decide on what our comparison units are and where we think that comparison would be the most interesting and useful in relation to the research question and the context. So this could be, for example, the experiences between men and women seem to be, if our hypothesis is that the difference between men and women will be quite stark and gender does play a role in determining who gets laid off and the access they have once to support once they are laid off, then gender becomes a comparison unit. And in the last is where we add in for diversity. But here's where we actually don't add in an equal number for everybody else. And we don't do this for enabling comparison, but the purpose of this is to ensure that our sample does include the voices and perspectives of a broader range of individuals. So we can, within comparison units of men and women, make sure that some of the women or men represent those living with disability, from ethnic minority groups, or any other identity or perspective that we feel we need to include in our sample size. And here, we don't have to make sure that we're not going to, even if you have, for example, only 2 interviews of people from ethnic minority groups, we won't actually then compare and say, this is how the experiences of those from minority groups is different from those who are not, because it's 2 versus maybe 14 other interviews. But we make sure that in our comparison of men versus women, it does include the voices of those from different backgrounds and identities. So just to give you an example of what this looks like mathematically, we start with our entry point and we select 8 and 8 of who we want. We can add in a comparison group where we can say we want to include older women, older men, younger men, and we make sure that there are at least 4 of each of these groups, so we can have some cross-group comparison. And then within this, we include we make sure that from who we're looking at in terms of women and men, that this is a more inclusive grouping of people that are interviewed. And that's how we ensure diversity, but not really increase our sample size. I will pause here, given that I have raced through a lot of information, and really open up the floor for any questions anyone may have. And after that, we'll go into a small group exercise where we can try practicing this sampling technique so that it can make it, I think, so that it is more illustrative, and I think that point can be made easier. But I'll open up for any questions anyone has at the moment.
There is actually a comment. I don't know if you can comment on the chat, like from Josephine. she said that consideration of indigenous and other different worldviews, research is still very technocrat and imperial in many senses. I don't know how if you would like to comment it.
Thanks, Eugene. I mean, I think that's a really important point. And in terms of what the focus is and the tools we use it can seem really technocratic. I would just, it would be useful to understand, Josephine, what the specific question is, or is the question, if I've understood correctly, maybe how we've tried to overcome it. If we have, I'm just not fully sure. So if you could just, if you could just unmute, and if you would be open to just providing a little bit more background of what you were intending to ask or say through this comment.
I was just responding that to the questions you were posting earlier, like as a additional constraint to our research works.
Oh, okay. So it was related to what, like when you talk about why is research not inclusive and not ethical, what are some of the constraints? And one of the constraints is that research, the approach is very technocratic and imperial in a lot of senses. And there's not ample consideration for indigenous and different worldviews. Is that, have I gotten it correct?
Yep.
Okay. I mean, you are right. And I think one of the things that we also wanted to do and speaking of research being imperial, is that the reason to have this mentorship process and emphasize on local researchers is that often in development, the way research gets designed is that you have an external and often Western researcher who comes in and leads the design and analysis, and data collection is usually the space where local researchers are involved the most. And that is something that we want to, as a practice, try stepping out of. And even if that means it takes a little bit more time to conduct the research, it is something that we are really keen on pushing and making as a standard methodology of whenever we conduct research. Does anyone else have any questions, thoughts or comments before we move into the group exercise?
There is a question on chat, if I may read. It appears from Catherine Allen. So it appears that the lens of sampling is still very heteronormative and assuming preconceived gender norms. So how do we overcome this and to be genuinely intersectional?
Hi, Catherine, that's an excellent question. And I do think that's a major limitation to how we've illustrated the example of this sampling approach. And it is something that we can go back to. So your first, for example, an entry point doesn't even have to be based on gender. So you can come in as an entry point of those who live in urban areas or rural areas, or it could be based on occupation. Based on your research question, it could be based on it, or you could be those who work in informal spaces versus informal spaces, or those with social protection, and then those without. And then as you would like to do, and then when you move into your comparison units, that's where your comparison unit is. And in your diversity, you make it a way more, you open up and ensure that you're bringing in people from across the spectrum, whether it's gender or sexuality, to try to overcome that distinction. And especially if you don't want to re-legitimize this like fixed notion of men versus women. And so that would be one approach to change it. But very good point and well noted. And I do think we'll go back on our examples to see how, even as we're explaining this sampling technique, it doesn't reaffirm some of those distinctions. All right. I got a direct message from Sophia. I hope you're okay if I read it out. Which is, in terms of how do we decolonize research methodology? And that's a really, really important question. And one of the first things that I think I was mentioning at the beginning of this Q&A session is that we do want to make sure that this balance of who does research design versus who leads data collection is changed, and the selection of tools and how we want to collect information, the processes through which we do it should be something that is more locally led and owned, and it does not come in from an external place, because that's where there is that huge power imbalance on deciding. The other is, I think it's a much broader endeavor which goes beyond just this PowerPoint, is that I think something that we've been really keen on is to really push back on when, especially in development and when policymakers, when we use the word evidence-based or evidence-informed, because evidence in a lot of ways gets seen as certain types of reports or a certain type of expertise that or certain types of methodologies that are seen as real evidence, and then other types of knowledge, whether they're lived experiences that do not that aren't presented in a similar way, aren't seen as worthy of the same and having the same amount of insight. And that so something that we also want to push and move away from is maybe reconsidering, and this is a debate we keep having internally, is whether we want to use the word evidence and actually just broaden it up to knowledge, and actually move from being informed to from being based to just being informed, and continue to reiterate that there are different types of knowledge that are really important to ensuring that our programs and policies are responsive and effective. I hope that answers some of your question, but this is it's a really important and really big conversation, and something that I'm really keen on continuing to have with whoever would be interested, and continuing to also hear your suggestions on it. If there are no more questions, what I will do is, for the next 10 minutes, if we could really just, if we could just practice a bit of the sampling techniques, and it shouldn't be longer than under 10 minutes, but what I've done is we've created a Jamboard, and I'll just send you the link for it. If you go access it, for those of you who are who have attended this session through a laptop, that's probably going to be the easiest. But if you go and see, and I'll just drop the link in the chat box, you'll see that there's a group name, and then there's a question, which is, this is just a hypothetical question, which is, what is the impact of COVID-19 on street vendors in Bangkok? And if you start off, we'll divide you into groups, and it's basically just writing on these sticky notes the entry criteria on who you think, whose voices and experience and perspectives do you think are required to be part of the research to answer this, what your comparison units will be that you think are most interesting and relevant to you, and please note what your sample units are. What is your diversity criteria? So within these comparison groups, whose voices do you want to ensure are definitely represented? And then what is your final sample size? We were going to divide you into 4 groups. And so if once you enter, please write your group name so that no one else comes and works on your group. And you can go to different boards by clicking any of these cursors right on top. So we can do that just for 5 to 10 minutes as a quick practice, and then we can come back and I can close the session. Hi, I think like by the time I sent the link, I also went into the breakout room. But I've sent the link, so I hope everyone can access it. I don't know if there's a way to send it to.
Do you want to just put it in the chat and I'll broadcast it to everyone?
Yeah, I've already put it in the chat.
I can't see it. Can you send it again? Let's see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Will they be able to?
Yep, I have sent it to everyone. Let me join one room.
We can bring them back.
Sumaya, could you please go into breakout room number 3 and support them?
Yeah, sure. Could you put me in? I don't know if maybe because I'm not co-host anymore. And that could be because I got disconnected at one point.
Yeah, that's okay. Let me see. Yep, move to room 3. Yep, are you seeing any pop-up message?
We can bring people back in about 2 minutes because it's because I'm aware that we're in our last like 9 minutes of this session. I see. There's some people who, I think there's some people who are just like one person per group. And
do you want me to close the room soon?
yeah, we can say 1 more minute and we can bring people back because I think in some of the rooms, I don't know how many people have people like even other people to discuss with.
Yeah.
In group 7, 2 people haven't joined. I joined group 3 and there's only Catherine and no one else was speaking.
Okay, I'll close the room now. Oh, actually, it started counting down now. Okay, we'll have to wait a little bit.
No worries.
Yes, Sumaya, everyone has come back to the main room.
Okay. Sorry guys about the confusion with the Jamboard or if the link didn't reach, but I did see some, especially with group 1, there's been quite a bit of activity. Hope this process, oh, we've got up to group 3. We did pull everyone back sooner. Does anyone have any reflections or thoughts? Was this in terms of trying to ensure that your sample size is manageable, but you're also, we're also making sure that we're thinking explicitly about diversity and inclusion? Was this process of an approach to look at sampling useful, even different from things that you may have already been doing? But it was just a quick question if anyone had any reflections, and then I'll just go through the last 2 slides to close this session. But I did want to give people a chance in case anyone had anything they'd like to share or okay, so I will take that silence as maybe everyone's still thinking. Very happy to continue this discussion at a different time and place, even if it's online. But I did want to close with finally, just really we coming to the last few stages. There was obviously a lot of care and thought in thinking about the tools and setting up the interview and conducting the interview. And here's where a lot of emphasis when we talk about ethical research to come up. A few of the points that we've learned, for example, something that we did want to be really careful of in terms of how we designed the tool and how we were asking questions is to not have people through our questioning leave people in a way that they were feeling unsettled or embarrassed. So to really make sure that you had warm up and warm down questions so that the research and the conversation follows a bit of an arc where you build people up to a moment of asking questions that may be more difficult to answer. And then you do close with making sure that you are with some level of positivity, you're leaving people not feeling more anxious and stressed than they were when because as a result of the questions one has asked. We do think that 3 themes is ideal. Asking more takes too much time and is not possible. And again, this links back to our focus on depth more than breadth. Avoid asking embarrassing and hurtful questions. For example, during COVID and impact of COVID, a lot of questions were on impact. It is really distressing to be able to acknowledge if you've been unable to provide for your family, whether it's food or educational expenses. So making sure that the way the questions are designed, they account for it. So for example, asking what has been everybody else's experience and not just yours, and allowing for that space for people to provide information without feeling embarrassed. Especially with questions when it comes to GBV and violence, really thinking, are we qualified to ask those questions and not asking them if we aren't, but being prepared if you think it's going to come up, being prepared with either resources or referral services that you can offer if someone does ask or does mention if it does come up. In terms of setting up the interview, something that we did wanted, something that was important was also the opportunity cost of participating. So, for example, we were interviewing women later in the evening, and it was a time when they usually cooked food for their families. So we did provide food, not just for them, but for their entire family when they were coming in for interviews. And then during conducting the interview, I think one of the things that we do want to highlight is consent. A lot of people follow the practice of a consent form. Something that we wanted to be really explicit about is that consent is continuous and needs to be checked through the course of the interview and not just at the beginning. So after every time we moved from one theme to another, we did ask if our participant was okay with us continuing, asking questions on a particular theme, and if they really just wanted to opt out of the interview altogether, which is also fine. In the data analysis bit, this is the process that we are in right now. And I think what we wanted to really highlight is to check for our own biases and create a process that doesn't, where our findings aren't based on what struck us the most, but is actually what's coming out of the data, because as a lot of you had mentioned, the voices that we are gathering are the most important. And then finally, with our closing reflections, something that we had covered in the beginning is we started off with thinking maybe should we do a rapid research, but actually we wanted to remove the sense of urgency. We also wanted to be, we also acknowledged that many of our researchers were facing similar stresses during COVID. We only have 5 out of the 7 cities that we embarked on, and that's because of either COVID, but one of our cities was in Myanmar, where the safety of both our research participants and researchers could not be guaranteed. In many cases, we had to shift to being online, and that comes to pragmatism. So I think it just concludes with saying that there is no thing as perfect research, and we all will have limitations, and being aware of them and being very them, and then continuing to focus on that depth is more important than trying to make sure that each research process tries to cover everything. And the last is earmarking time and resources to support your research ethics plan. So whether it's provision of refreshments, booking a safe space where people can come speak, paying for phone cards, or having the time to put together resources and referral services for GBV or government schemes that we weren't actually covering or providing through our research is really important, so that can be provided during the interview. I will close for now. This was a really rapid review an overview of what we have tried to do over the last year. We're still very much in the process of refining this and learning from it. But thank you so much for joining and hearing us share this process, and would be very happy to hear any feedback and thoughts and continue this conversation later. And Eugene is here, so I'll give it back to Eugene and we can close this session.
Thank you, Sumaya, and thank you for the remaining 20 participants who are still here. And if you have questions, you may contact Sumaya. And this is a recorded session anyway. Thank you very much and have a good day.